A Dragon Quest Battle Royale. I don't think I ever expected that we'd get here, but here we are with Dragon Quest Champions. I really enjoy the Battle Royale genre as a whole, and I think Square Enix's use of the Final Fantasy franchise with Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier was really cool and really successfully implemented elements of Final Fantasy into the Battle Royale style game. So I was really excited to see when they announced this game, exactly how would they do that with Dragon Quest. And in playing the beta for this game, it's been one of the most bizarre experiences I've had in a long time, I feel like. This is going to be a dense video, so get ready, but excuse me if I get any details wrong here, because the game is entirely in Japanese, and my Japanese is a very baby amount, so... But yeah, so Battle Royales are typically kind of action-oriented games, right? And while Dragon Quest has action-style games in the past, this title in particular is faithful to the turn-based nature of kind of the main series. So exactly how that works is kind of strange. So I think we'll just kind of go through, what the typical flow of a match is. So similar to most other Battle Royale games, you have kind of the drop moment at the beginning. So you start out on a boat, and this boat's like going around this island, and there's like 3 different cities you can choose from that you can jump towards. And when you click it, basically your character will jump and fly through the sky, and you can kind of navigate left and right, and then also choose if you want to just drop immediately wherever you are. So you can kind of like scope out the landscape, see what kind of resources there are as you kind of go to, this final destination. The main goal once you land is basically to build 3 different stats. One is like an attack stat, the second one's a defense stat, and then there's also an HP and MP stat, basically. So the 3 different categories of resources that you gather, and they all start at 0 when you first land, essentially. So what you do is you kind of pick and choose which enemies to grind as you land. So each enemy seems to favor different types of these stats, or they might exclusively only drop one particular stat. So you might want to fight enemies like crabs that help, increase your defensive score, or there's like these like yellow onion guys that basically can let you level up your HP and MP up to like level 10 or something like that. So you kind of go around and you choose which enemies to grind, and the enemies all have different difficulty levels. So, if you wanted to farm higher level enemies, you need to grind up on the lower level enemies first and foremost. And while you're grinding, you can also like search for different barrels and chests that you can open for various different, Dragon Quest items that let you heal yourself or recover magic points or have different like effects that will increase your character's strength or make the enemies you're fighting sleep or stunned or things like that. But once you feel comfortable after you kind of landed and got yourself situated, you'll want to go ahead and start engaging other parties. In Battle Royale fashion, a bunch of people are on this island running around, also grinding the same resources that you are. And so when you encounter somebody, there is actually this brief bit of action, because when you're running on the map, you can actually go ahead and attack enemies using a single strike or like a magic blast and things like that. And if the person that hits the other person first gets a advantage at the beginning of the battle, or you can just like walk into each other and then there won't be any advantage, but generally somebody will hit the other player essentially. And then so once you get into the battle, it becomes, more or less that standard Dragon Quest battle mode, but in a competitive sense, as you're using, attack, spells, and abilities against each other, and then whoever wins at the end will basically get the other player's stats that they collected throughout that round. You can also find other players who are fighting each other, and their encounters will be in like these puffs of smoke. And so basically you or somebody else can invade either your fight or a fight that you just came across, and you can kind of take advantage of different situations where, maybe you'll sit there and see these 2 characters fighting, and if they fight for long enough, you might be able to get in at like down to the end part of the battle when both sides have kind of like use their resources and they're both weakened and kind of overtake both of them and steal all their stats. There's also, and I think this is like standard for the Dragon Quest franchise, there's like a tension meter, and when you engage with enemies and do different attacks and things like that, this meter will build, and it basically lets you execute a special attack, and this tension meter can be built up and carried around with you, so you don't have to use it in each encounter that you built it. So you can go like grind lower level enemies to build this tension meter, even if you don't necessarily need, the stats from them anymore. more. And these tension moves can also often be like a very quick way to go ahead and take a group out. You catch them off guard, you just kind of come in and nuke them and basically move on without having to really do a fight. Essentially, this is the flow, and you just kind of rinse and repeat that, all while trying to stay within the circle in typical Battle Royale fashion. So it's a pretty simple loop that's very similar to other Battle Royale games. However, the actual action of what you're doing is very different. And then also, it's less about, well, it's not only about, but it's definitely less about the actual execution in that moment. It's often a game that's a lot about just like how you build resources up until that point. When you're moving about this island, are you grinding the right types of enemies for you? And is that getting you in a position where you can effectively combat other players that you kind of come across? And so it's a very stat-oriented system in a lot of ways, which can make it hard to determine like what went wrong at the end of a game, because if you get into a fight and somebody just like steamrolls you, you don't necessarily know what steps they took in order to get to that point, essentially. However, you can just kind of tell from afar, who is a higher level than you. Characters are basically marked with an aura that defines their level, either blue if they're weaker than you, no aura means they're around the same level as you, and there's a red and a purple aura, and those are like, hey, hard or very hard. And when you see those harder players, usually the best course of action is to avoid them and try to prep more and try to get into a position where you can challenge them later. And if you are kind of locked in with somebody at the end who's significantly higher level than you, then there's not really a lot you can do other than just try to outmaneuver them and have them die to the circle somehow. But the reality is that you're probably screwed if you didn't manage your resources properly before the end of the game to meet the same level as they did. So. But execution in battle does matter. Like, don't get me wrong, this is not just about stat farming and things like that. Items also can turn the tide of battles, so it's important to collect some of those and at least have a handful of options available to you that your own abilities might not be able to do. But abilities are also a big part of this game too. But what abilities you have is not determined in the mid-match itself. It's something you actually pre-decide before you get into a game. So true to kind of the RPG roots, like this game actually has a pretty significant gear and party build focus. And this is something that doesn't happen mid-match. This is something you do just sitting on the menu ahead of time, essentially. So you can basically have three party members rather in your group. And each of these party members can be assigned a different class. So you have warriors, priests, mage, thief, and martial artists in the beta. I'm sure that will expand as the game goes on. I personally chose the first three on that list as my party makeup here. And so these classes, have levels associated with them. And so you can go ahead and grind them up, and they have stats associated with them, and I believe skills as well that are a part of the class too. And these levels and skills carry over between games. These are not things that you build only within the match itself. So when you're killing enemies mid-game, you're gaining EXP to your total class level as a whole. And there's also like a story mode, but it is a single-player story mode thing where you can also kind of grind out your levels and get different gear and different, there's like these medals you can get that also affect your stats and things like that too. It's very like Monster Hunter style though, so the quests are just kind of like, go hunt this enemy in this little area kind of thing. Or they'll have like an AI Battle Royale thing going on, because being Dragon Quest champions, it's a story about becoming the champion of all these different tournaments essentially. But gear is I think the bigger decider of exactly what you're going to be doing in battle with the character. The stats in this game seem to be kind of, standard for the rest of the Dragon Quest franchise. I will say I'm not super familiar with Dragon Quest as a whole, but, essentially you have modifiers for things like physical and magical attack and defense stats. There's also modifiers that are attached to different spell types and things like that. So it'd be like, oh, this increases your fire spell effect by like 5%. For me specifically, it was a little hard to tell how deep this got because it was all in Japanese, but there definitely were a lot of different stats associated with items and weapons and things like that. Especially as you started leveling those items and weapons up because they have their own leveling system attached to them as well. Gear is a part of this game, but although a bigger thing, maybe even more so than gear, I feel like everything is bigger than the last thing, is weapons, because weapons seem to have a bigger impact on your actual class play style, where, essentially you can have weapons that have abilities and skills and spells on them that are more focused on offensive elements versus defensive elements. And so spells and things like that you want to use, you'll have to get the right weapon to utilize those, essentially. But this gear and these stats and these weapons alone won't carry you through a match. You still need to grind out that attack, defense, and HP and MP value in the game. But what it does do is it gives you an advantage when you are in situations when your stats are closer. It gives you the opportunity to have different strategies that you do mid-battle and things like that. And so when you're battling players with similar level gear as you, it will give you the ability to kind of outplay them. And when you're battling lower level players who are, grinding the same way as you mid-match, but maybe didn't do as good of a job with like prepping their gear ahead of time, you're going to have an advantage over them. And so it creates this really, really different Battle Royale type game where pre-prep in a lot of ways, in terms of like stats and things like that, it is just as important as your execution mid-match. However, in the beta here, there are definitely issues throughout this game. One being that the ring, that if you don't know in Battle Royale games, when you're outside the ring, you take damage, and the longer the match goes on, the more and more damage this ring does. And in a game that you can move around freely in, it is pretty easy to avoid this ring for the most part, but it does imply stress and things like that to positioning. In this game, the ring is very devastating, if only because when you get in battle, it's incredibly hard to get out of battle. There are items that let you get out of battle easier, but it is difficult to run away if you don't have something to assist you with escaping a battle. And so if you get outside the ring mid-battle, it's almost a guaranteed death late game. And so a lot of games seem to end with some team that got stuck outside the ring and they're stuck in a fight with each other and they are just dying from the ring, basically. So you really have to be aware of your surroundings, especially late game, and make sure, that you are fighting within a space that you have plenty of time to finish that encounter and move on, because if you don't, pretty much the entire group of people involved in that fight will be dead, essentially. So it's also really hard to be aware of your surroundings. When you get in fights with people, they teleport you off to like this special area, and that special area is not representative of the area that you got in a fight in. It does not let you see people running around you. Like, you just end up in this space where you feel like you're cut off from the rest of the world, including the ring. You do have access to this map at the top right of the screen that gives you some information, but I really wish that there was just felt like you were more in the world itself, because right now it definitely feels like you're just kind of in your own little space and that you just don't really know what's happening outside of that combat. And lastly, while I personally have not had that much experience with touchscreen games in an action setting, I personally found that the controls just felt very awkward. This might not be an issue if you are traditionally doing action games on a touchscreen phone, but I found that made it so engaging with other players and doing dances and using some of the more movement-based items, like there's like a pitfall in this game where you can trap players in a hole, just felt really hard to be effective at, because the controls are very, very clunky to me. But I will say, I am somebody who does not typically play phone games with a touchscreen, so. The biggest elephant in this room that I think most people will be bothered by, but I could be wrong, is this is a free-to-play RPG. So when you think of games like Puzzles and Dragons and things like that, or like your various gacha games out there, you're feeding weapons to weapons. You have gold that you have to pay to merge weapons and level them up. You have to pull weapons from a pull thing. And what weapons you get determine your play style, and like if you get weapons that don't complement each other, then you're at a disadvantage than other players who have weapons that complement each other. And while the beta had no monetary elements, clearly this is gonna be accepting money at some point. And so, it's going to be a situation where, somebody's gonna be able to pay money to get more opportunities to or get more access to more resources to build up their gear and things like that. So if that's something that really bothers you in concept, then I think this game is a complete no-go, because really you're gonna be at a disadvantage versus a player that pays more money. There's answer is to this question is we're going to be ranking players by what your character level is, what your gear is, what these medals are, and that will determine where you get paired in actual games. The actual execution of that, I'm sure that's something that's going to, change over time. It's going to depend on the number of players playing the game and things like that. So, whether it's a good answer or not is, I think, another very different thing. But I think many, many people will be very frustrated with that concept as a whole and will be, completely avoid it. And I think that's absolutely like definitely a way I can see with this game, receiving it. And I don't blame anybody from being like, I don't want to mess with that kind of thing. Although recently I've been trying to focus more on what actual impacts a lot of these systems have rather than like the higher level concept of like pay to win. What does it mean to be able to pull these weapons? What does it mean to be able to get more access to different resources? And how does that actually affect the game? I really don't see a situation where Dragon Quest Champions isn't a balancing nightmare. I do think it's kind of fascinating that this game seems to not care that people can spend money on it and get an advantage in the pre-prep game. Because, when you think of most of these free-to-play Battle Royale games, everything that matters outside of your skill is something that is determined in match, right? You come into the game pretty much fresh every time, and Dragon Quest Champions doesn't do that. And it just makes it kind of an interesting situation where there's this whole other element to a game outside of the Battle Royale aspect that you can interact with, and that will have a major impact on how you succeed in match, which just isn't something I've experienced in a Battle Royale before. So it seems like a balancing nightmare. I'm sure for a lot of people this will ruin the game, and even for me it might ruin the game as well. But it certainly has a unique feel at the very least because of that. Either way, this is a game that unfortunately probably is not going to get localized. I could be wrong, but I also anticipate this will shut down in a year or so, like most Square Enix live games. I think it's a really cool concept overall. I'm glad somebody at some point thought, like, what is a Dragon Quest Battle Royale? And then somebody at some point said, yeah, you could do that. they decided to do it. And it's just I don't know if you'll ever see another game like this. But we'll have to see how intense the pay to win aspect is, and if that basically makes it so there's no fun to be had. But I would expect that it's going to be more of a thing that the pay to win part will be more of a frustration that is a perceived frustration every time you lose a fight, rather than being able to tell exactly when somebody got the resources that they needed through paying money. But hopefully it's something that turns out great. I really think it's a fascinating idea at the very least, and I'd love to see it succeed. But I just don't have a lot of confidence that it will, and I imagine it will be gone not too long in the future.